Accountability, in name only.
Apparently, I guess you have a warrant?
For what?
I'm not sure.
For voter stuff, man.
For voters. So you have a warrant. It's for voter fraud, okay?
I'm like, voter fraud? I voted, but I ain't commit no fraud.
But these people, they, ultimately they lied on the form, and there are consequences for lying, and we're going to enforce and uphold the laws in Florida, and that's what we're doing.
I'm Todd Zwillich, and this is Breaking the Vote, our series where we track the growing assault on voting rights and efforts to undermine democracy in America. The gavels are flying all over the country. Judges, juries, grand juries are all busy trying to hold people responsible for attacking democracy. It can be maddeningly slow, but in Washington, more than 400 people have pled guilty for participating in January 6th. One rider got convicted and got more than 7 years. In Georgia, a prosecutor looks to charge people who tried to steal the 2020 election. And in Colorado, a former county clerk faces 6 felony charges for breaking into voting machines, fraud, and impersonation. Will federal grand juries in Washington charge Donald Trump or his inner circle for the coup attempt? We don't know. We get super focused on courts and coup plotters. I know I do. But it's really only one kind of accountability that needs to happen if the country's ever going to heal from this anti-democratic spasm that we're going through. We want to explore that accountability. Yeah, the legal kind for sure, but let's be real. Election denial, disinformation, the normalization of Trumpism, they didn't conjure themselves out of thin air. News corporations, social media, mega companies, and their extravagant donations all had a hand in this. And what about voters? The politicians, Republican or Democratic, who've helped undermine democracy or fight to protect it or done nothing at all, are supposed to face ultimate accountability at the ballot box. Of course, that can't happen if election liars and coup plotters aren't held responsible. It also won't happen if institutions that have helped spur this on aren't held accountable to something beyond self-protection and profit. That's not about Republicans or Democrats. It's about a system that we all have a stake in having a chance to function. This week, we go behind the legal jeopardy the former president finds himself in after attacking both elections and apparently national security secrets, and why we might have to wait a while for answers. Plus, how the press has helped destabilize the republic it was created to protect. But first, we go to Florida for a look at how those who were promised the restoration of their voting rights post-prison are finding their accountability being used as a prop in the governor's quest for 2024.
Few officials use the power of the executive branch to make political statements quite like Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. He's regulated language in elementary schools and used Florida taxpayer money to fly migrants from Texas to Massachusetts. And then there are elections. DeSantis said Florida had no issues in the 2020 election, but he's overseen a new election crime unit, which got to work in August by going after some pretty specific targets.
The state of Florida has charged and is in the process of arresting 20 individuals across the state for voter fraud.
The task force arrested 20 people for illegally voting. All of them had been previously convicted of a felony. Now, Florida did restore voting rights to most people convicted of felonies when it passed Amendment 4 back in 2018. But these people weren't included in that because they've been convicted of murders or sexual crimes. But most of them said that they thought they were eligible to vote, and some had even received voter registration cards. If it was just a confusion, it would seem easy enough to just not let them vote without the whole arrest part.
Apparently, I guess you have a warrant?
For what?
I'm not
It's
sure.
for voter stuff, man.
For voters.
It's what it is. I think the agents with FDLE talked to you last week about some voter fraud, voter stuff, when you weren't supposed to be voting, maybe.
I didn't.
So
What are they talking about?
that's
man?
what
Why is they-
we're not the case agents, but what you got to do, they have reduced your bond quite a bit. It's 2 felony charges for voter fraud, but they've reduced it to $500 bonds. So it's $1,000 total.
Oh my God, man! What
So, yes, sir. So unfortunately, right now we're gonna have to take you to jail
The situation is confusing apparently for both voters and law enforcement. But what's also confusing is the timing. The arrests come just a few months before a consequential midterm election and more than a year after the alleged crimes.
I'm like, voter fraud. I voted, but I ain't commit no fraud.
Well, so that's the thing. I don't know exactly what happened with it, but you do have a warrant. That's what it's for. Okay.
Oh my God.
The guy who oversees elections in the Election Crime Unit is Florida's Secretary of State Cord Byrd, who still questions the 2020 election result. 64-year-old Robert Simpson told WPTV station, which is in West Palm Beach, that he thought his voting rights had been restored, especially after filling out a voter application and then being sent voter registration cards from his local supervisor of elections. Why was he told he could vote?
So he wasn't told he could vote. Once again, when you fill out that card and you say that you are an eligible voter, we confirm that someone is a living, breathing human being and they are sent a voter information card. And that's what it is called in statute. It doesn't say this is a legal document. It doesn't say that this means you're valid to vote. It is an informational card only that everyone receives, whether or not they have been truthful on the form.
So the onus is on the voter, you're saying?
That's what the courts have said. Now, for anybody, any felon who wants to know whether their rights have been restored, this office, under the Division of Elections and our General Counsel's office, anyone can seek an advisory opinion. That is on our website. But these people, ultimately they lied on the form, and there are consequences for lying, and we're going to enforce and uphold the laws in Florida, and that's what we're doing.
The Florida ACLU told us that the cases could, quote, intimidate voters who would otherwise be eligible to vote. It's also tough to prosecute anyone without proof they intended to break the law. One case has already been dismissed on procedural grounds. The arrests were mostly made in Democratic counties, and DeSantis has made sure credit goes to his administration and the election crimes team. There have also been other instances in the past year and a half in places like The Villages, which is a really Republican stronghold for the governor. And why was there this fanfare over these 20 felons in this one part of the state, and why not a press conference for the people who double voted and admitted it in The Villages?
Sure, and those two people pled guilty recently. So, and then there's the ghost candidate trial going on, I believe in Miami.
Yeah.
So it's not just solely the state's role to prosecute. The state attorney and local law enforcement can prosecute and are prosecuting, and that's good, and we support them. So I'm surprised when, not from you, but in others in the media have criticized, it's like, we're not gonna step in when there's already a prosecution taking place.
I guess I just mean more of like the fanfare around it.
Right.
There's this big press conference with the governor, law enforcement standing behind them in uniform. That didn't happen with The Villages. Why was that?
Local law enforcement was already engaged in that process. I mean, this office was created. It was started on July 1 is when it went into effect. So it was new, and it was interesting because up until that time, I kept getting inquiries. Well, what are you doing? Why isn't it doing anything? What is its purpose? No, we haven't heard anything. And then as soon as we go do something, then it's, well, why did you need to do this? So it's no surprise that Governor DeSantis and championing the Office of Election Crimes and Security in the legislature would want to promote the fact that we are going to enforce our laws, and we take election fraud and any instances of election fraud seriously in the state.
This isn't the first time Republicans have tried to undermine Amendment 4, which passed with a clear majority in 2018. As soon as the law went into effect, the state legislature interpreted it to require returning citizens to pay fines, fees, or restitution. And there's still not an easy way to figure out what you owe. Why doesn't the Secretary of State's office just maintain a list of those people?
So it's part of it is the information coming from the clerks of court level, because every county does it a little differently. But ultimately, the person needs to be responsible, and they know whether or not they owe fines, fees, and restitution, and they can go and check if they're not sure.
Well, my experience talking with a lot of these people was that they didn't know sometimes, and they found it very, very difficult to figure out if they could go vote. So it sounds like, and you're kind of saying this too, it's a difficult system, it sounds like, right?
I don't know that it's that difficult, but I think it takes effort. And I think if citizenship requires participation and effort, and if individuals want to be returned to full citizenship status, For those who really want to regain those rights, they will go and do the necessary work to make sure that they are eligible. So I think the resources are there for those who put in the effort to want to, once again, regain the franchise.
And you think you and your office are doing all you can to help those people?
We are, and we're doing everything we can. We look to improve every single day to make sure that every single eligible voter in Florida has that opportunity and those resources are made available to them.
The former president is in legal jeopardy, right up to his problematic hair. It's at every level: civil, criminal, state, federal, you name it. But Greg Walters tells us why many of the suits dogging Trump might be on hold. Plus, the former Facebook elections boss who's now warning of a disinformation tsunami ahead. But up next, the legally sketchy MAGA grift coming from Trump world and why it could come back to bite the former guy. This is Breaking the Vote. I'm Todd Zwillich. Former President Trump's allies have been charged in a lot of criminal investigations, but so far, the ex-president has faced no accountability for his role in the January 6th insurrection, his alleged election interference, or his dangerous lies about a stolen election. In fact, Trump and his friends are actually profiting from all of that, like his Save America Leadership PAC that he created just days after losing the election. It's already raked in more than $135 million, and the money keeps flowing. But is his political fundraising machine even legal? I spoke to Adav Noti, legal director of the Campaign Legal Center, about Trump's Stop the Steal Millions and a whole lot more. Adav Noti, thanks for joining me. Well, it's been reported that the grand jury looking into January 6th and the coup attempt in Washington, D.C. has expanded its scope, now looking at Donald Trump's fundraising, the Save America PAC. What do you suspect they're looking at there? What are they looking for?
There have been questions floating around since even before January 6th about some of the money that was raised in connection with that post-election period in 2020. It was a very large amount of money, and it came in arguably being raised under sort of false pretenses, and then very little of it was spent. And so there have been questions for a long time about sort of why was that money raised and where did it go? And those questions remain unresolved to this day. I think the question that the investigation is probably looking into is, was the money raised under fraudulent pretenses? Was it raised with the intention of never being spent on the activities that the solicitation said it would be spent on? So if you go out and raise $100 million saying you're going to spend it to, say, contest the 2020 election, you know the whole time that you're going to spend very, very little of that money on those activities, it may rise to the level of fraudulent solicitation or other, otherwise defrauding the people who gave the money.
I think that most of the political appeals I see are basically bullshit. I mean, they might make appeals on lots of stuff and not really spend the money there. So what's different here?
I think arguably the difference is that many of the solicitations that went out from sort of the Trump fundraising entities in that post-election period in 2020 had language that was very specific. It said, contribute to our election defense fund or things along those lines. And there was no election defense fund. And it must have become clear very early on in that post-election period that the Trump fundraising entities had already raised far more money than they could ever spend on those activities.
So what happens if, or maybe I should say when, Donald Trump announces that he's running for president? He's got $135 million, maybe it's more now, in the Save America PAC. How does declaring himself a candidate, even in the media, change how he can spend this money or how this money operates in the real world, or even his legal liability for that matter?
Well, I think first, I think for legal purposes, there is a very strong argument that Trump is already a candidate for the presidency in 2024. For legal purposes, candidacy doesn't turn on any sort of public declaration. Somebody becomes a candidate under the law when they decide to run for the office and they start spending money on it. And that, I think, has pretty clearly already happened. Trump even said publicly that he was running, and he sort of had an opportunity to walk it back and chose not to. The Federal Election Commission has received a complaint already alleging that Trump has become a candidate for 2024. But even if, assume for the sake of argument that for legal purposes he has not become a candidate already, once he does, that money that has been raised since the last election is off limits to the 2024 candidacy. A campaign fundraising entity is under totally different rules than the entities that have been raising money up to this point. So that $100 million, it can stay in the bank, it can stay in those entities, or it could be spent on non-campaign activity, but it can't go to support the 2024 campaign.
So let's take a step back from campaign fundraising just for a second. Just talk about accountability, talk about the law. I mean, so many people in Donald Trump's orbit have already been prosecuted or are on the radar of prosecutors. Why do you think it is that none of these prosecutions so far have never touched Trump himself?
Well, I think there are many ways in which the question of criminally prosecuting a former president of the United States is different from bringing other prosecutions. I think the legal considerations are different and the practical considerations are different. What you're trying to do is set up a deterrent so that people in the future don't try to engage in this sort of conduct on behalf of a sitting president, that it serves the purpose just as well to bring charges against the president's close advisors or others who are enabling that activity, and that can serve to deter the conduct in the future, perhaps just as well as bringing charges against a former president, which may or may not be successful.
Now, that's federal prosecutors, but we have to talk about Georgia, and lots of former prosecutors, experts say the place to look for charges against Donald Trump, in addition to his inner circle, is really the state of Georgia. Do you agree with that? And does that get around some of the hurdles that you're talking about?
Well, there is a real risk of exposure, criminal exposure of the president in Georgia, and that is because, as we all know, he was personally and directly involved with what appears to have been illegal post-election activity in 2020.
I just want to find 11,780 votes.
So that is of a different kind than, say, the investigation into the fundraising in the post-election period, which presumably, Donald Trump wasn't personally sitting at a computer and typing fundraising emails, but he was personally getting on the phone and trying to pressure election officials to change election results. And so that is a different category of potential legal exposure.
Adav Noti, legal director of the Campaign Legal Center. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Up next, Greg Walters and the Justice Department rule, if you can even call it that, that's allowing the former president to sleep a little easier for the next couple of weeks. How even the presidential crime scandals of recent history don't prepare us for what Donald Trump could put us through real soon. The midterms are almost here. And that means that a certain protection that lets Donald Trump breathe a little easier these last few weeks is about to expire. That's the so-called 60-day rule, where the DOJ isn't supposed to take any action that could impact the election right before the vote. Action like indicting the de facto leader of the Republican Party. So what are we all in for after that rule expires on November 8th? Here's Greg Walters with more.
Welcome to the Watergate, scene of our country's most famous crime. This is the room where the leaders of a burglar team stayed up to monitor the midnight break-in of Democratic National Headquarters because they wanted to phone tap the political enemies of former President Richard Nixon. Now, it's a luxury suite where nostalgic guests can crank up groovy tunes, crack open the minibar, and think back to a simpler, more wholesome time in American politics. Not everyone remembers Watergate that way. Journalists and law enforcement traced the burglars back to Nixon's inner circle, and the red-hot scandal burned a hole in every American history book from 1972 to infinity.
People have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
People called Watergate our long national nightmare. Those poor fools didn't know how good they had it. Looking back, we can see there were guardrails in place that kept Watergate from getting really out of control. The first one was that being a criminal meant something. Getting too close to crime was politically disqualifying. Even just having a criminal aura made you tainted goods. Look at Nixon. He was never indicted, but after Watergate, he resigned from the presidency in disgrace and backed away from electoral politics forever.
And there's the president waving goodbye, and you hear the applause.
Look at him go. 50 years later, that idea seems quaint. One government accountability watchdog calculates that former President Donald Trump has been credibly accused of committing 55 criminal offenses. Talk about a vibrant criminal aura. A state prosecutor in Georgia is probing his attempt to reverse his 2020 electoral defeat. And of course, the Department of Justice is investigating whether he violated the Espionage Act by stashing top-secret files at his country club in Palm Beach. Does that mean Trump is backing away from politics like Nixon did? Hell no. For Trump, getting searched by the FBI is an applause line.
The Biden administration invaded the home of their chief political opponent, who is absolutely destroying him and everyone else in the polls. I hate to say it.
Trump says it's all a witch hunt and he's done nothing wrong. But the former prosecutors I talked to say the odds he'll be criminally charged have risen well over 50%. Imagine, for just a second, that after Watergate, Nixon turned around and ran for president again and called for mass protests if prosecutors didn't get off his case. Kind of like, this.
If these radical, vicious, racist prosecutors do anything wrong or illegal, I hope we are going to have in this country the biggest protest we have ever had.
Yikes. And that brings us to the second guardrail that helped keep Watergate so chill. Nixon's senior aides were convicted of serious crimes, but Nixon was labeled an unindicted co-conspirator, which is lawyer speak for, we know what you did, and we're not going to nail you, yet. Before they could act, Nixon's successor, President Gerald Ford, handed him a pardon and poof, gone went the charges.
I, Gerald R. Ford, President of the United States, have granted, and by these presents do grant, a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon.
Now, at the time, pissed off Democrats and everyday crime-hating Americans slammed Ford for derailing justice. But later, a lot of historians took a more kindly view. After all, Ford saved the country from going through a divisive criminal trial of a former president for what would have been the first time ever. Now, Ford's point was, we weren't ready for that.
I was absolutely convinced then, as I am now, that if we had had this series, an indictment, a trial, a conviction, and anything else that transpired after that, that the attention of the President, the Congress, and the American people would have been diverted from the problems that we have to solve.
And all this matters because the country's at an inflection point. Prosecutors try to avoid announcing big moves that could impact politics right before an election in what's called the 60-day rule. That means if they do decide they want to charge Trump, they've got a window of opportunity between the midterms of November 8th and the start of the presidential primaries in 2023. So if an indictment is going to happen, it could happen kind of soon. Now you might think there's some kind of law that says if you catch a criminal case, you can't run for president. There is no such thing. In reality, that's basically just a political custom that's starting to look increasingly antiquated. Legally speaking, you can be indicted, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison, and there's no rule in the book that stops you from winning a presidential election. What would happen after that is mind-boggling. And that's the point. There is simply no roadmap for where American politics looks to be headed next year. Because when you look back at the closest precedent we have, in some ways, it kind of looks like a nostalgic good time, which is literally what this room is now. The country survived Watergate with our political system intact because Nixon deep-sixed his own ambitions and Ford stymied the criminal process. One day, Ford just told us Watergate was done.
My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over.
Who is going to wake us up this time?
The 2016 and 2020 elections showed just how effectively social media can spread disinformation. Now with the midterms upon us and 2024 just around the corner, The former head of elections operations at Facebook is warning that the company and the country are not ready for the propaganda onslaught ahead. Welcome back to Breaking the Vote. In the years since a hostile foreign country was able to hack our political system with memes and propaganda largely on a single social media platform, Facebook has sunk about $13 billion into making sure that it doesn't happen again. But despite the billions, social media companies have not only failed to control disinformation and polarization on their platforms, their profit models are literally based on the outrage that helps that disinfo flourish. I spoke with former Facebook elections boss Katie Harbath, who's speaking out about a coming electoral tsunami, warning that the world is not ready, and neither is Facebook. Katie Harbath, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So manipulation of social media in the world of politics and culture isn't new, Katie. What's keeping you up at night right now?
What's keeping me up at night right now is a couple of things. One of them is just how decentralized and how many more platforms and surfaces there are where there's the potential for manipulation, whether it's the spread of mis or disinformation, whether it's to sow more discord between different people. So instead of just people using Facebook or YouTube, there's TikTok now, there's messaging apps, there's encrypted apps where it's even harder to see what you can't see what the content is, and there's even podcasts and radio and other places. And so it is much easier for bad actors to get their information out in a lot of different places and much harder to track that and know how to counter it.
When you look at Facebook and the distribution of information, the stuff that the algorithms, boost and get it into our bloodstream, what's the bigger threat right now? Is it stoking culture wars and polarization and sort of stoking division? Or is it that specific targeting, election interference, targeting voters right before November?
I think it's the former. I think it is the problems with social media and what can happen around elections doesn't just happen in the week or two before election day. It really is a long, ongoing process. And in many ways, right, we've not stopped the conversation from 2020. It continues on, and now people are sowing distrust in various voting methods. They continue to harass election officials and things of that nature that happen. And it's just a day in and day out campaign that a lot of these folks are doing that can make it much more challenging in order to combat it, unless you're actually, the platforms themselves and civil society and others are constantly trying to counter those messages as well with authoritative information and information for people to actually know the truth around the security of these different methods of voting.
The narrative in Republican politics right now, when it comes to social media and Facebook, is really one of victimology. It's conservatives, Republicans, Trump fans get censored, get shadow banned, get thrown off the platform. That really seems to be missing, maybe intentionally, I don't know, really missing the point about the true danger of social manipulation and social media.
I think too, the way I try to frame this conversation when I talk to people on the right, which I've done for a very long time on this, is the question really is, where do we draw those lines on these policies of what is or is not allowed on the platform and what the penalty should be for that? And those are harder questions to try to define. And I think people don't want to grab onto those third rails. But one of the things I'm trying to do in speaking out more and in doing the work that I'm doing today is really trying to get people to face up to those tough decisions that the companies have to face every day and try to bring that more out into the open, have more conversation on it so that, again, we as a society can come to an understanding and some new societal norms of what do we want, what is allowed speech, what is not allowed speech, how do we want to handle that? Because as long as we try to make it binary and simple like this, we're not going to actually solve the problem.
I got to say, Katie, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but we're not really in a moment right now to thoughtfully discuss societal norms and the future of our sort of common political identity. We're in a time where if you try to control what I say online, you're censoring me, you're the enemy, you're an authoritarian, end of conversation. That's really where we're at. Are we even in a place where we can have this conversation?
I don't think we have a choice. We have to have this conversation. And you're right, it's much harder in today's environment to even have that. But I don't know any other way forward. And I worry about, this is what I struggle with so much with the question around free speech, and then, but also what signals does that send to the rest of the world? If the beacon of democracy, the United States, is going to shut down political content, then they'll use it as justification to shut down content in their countries of minority voices and others. And that does really concern me. And no matter which way these decisions go on a lot of these different issues, there are going to be significant consequences. I don't want to say that there won't be. And it is a really difficult question of what are the ones that you're willing to live with. And none of them are going to be necessarily great, but we have to go into it with eyes wide open and try to just move forward, because I'm worried that if we don't keep trying to move forward, then that's definitely a recipe for democracy just perishing.
Katie Harbaugh, thanks so much for the work that you're doing, and thanks for joining us. Up next, holding the news media to account. How profit chasing and self-preservation are failing in a new and dangerous political world. The rules of covering politics and advancing accountability have changed. Is the news media up to the job of protecting democracy? While we're busy dealing out the accountability for a fraying political system, it's time for us here to look in the mirror. As much as any other institution, the press contributed to the mess that we're in. When Trump was on the rise, most of the political press stuck to convenient habits of reporting on normal old Democrats versus Republicans, when the politics that was really going on was anything but normal. I was totally guilty of this in 2015 and too far into 2016. But can this vital institution hold itself accountable and really get in shape to protect democracy? I sat down with NYU professor Jay Rosen to look at the ways that self-preservation and even selfishness make the news media easy marks for exploitation, and how we can all get honest and really get it right for 2024.
Let me start with the Electoral Count Act. Just 9 House Republicans voted for it. You're somebody who is very concerned about what happened on January 6th. I'll be honest with you. I'm surprised you didn't vote for it. Why?
Well, and as you know, Chuck,
Chuck Todd's actually talking about the coup attempt there. The Electoral Count Act is trying to legislate the last coup. Do you know that later on in this clip, also, Nancy Mace also says here the Constitution worked on that day.
She does.
She does.
Yeah. Like as if the system worked and it sort of held together and it wasn't really that much of a crisis.
Everything's fine.
Yeah, yeah. Also, like, what happened to explaining what these laws are supposed to do? Are we supposed to know already what the Electoral Count Act is? I mean, I read the news pretty regularly. I'm not sure I'm up on every provision in there. But this is for insiders who already are sort of part of that process.
In other words, does that mean he's asking her about the power moves of the Electoral Count Act, not these reforms trying to prevent another coup on the government of the United States and what they would do?
The whole show is not really from the point of view of a curious voter. It's pitched to the people who are either professionals in politics or who are paying attention all the time, or who have a kind of a specialist's understanding of how it works.
Well, if you liked that one, I think it goes on.
So Republicans pitched, Kevin McCarthy put out his pitch for, they called it a commitment to America on this. And part of it in there was accountability, and it's kind of vague. But you've heard some of the details, and I know you've talked about the idea that there may be a special select committee. Do you expect an impeachment vote against President Biden if Republicans take over the House?
I believe there's a lot of pressure on Republicans to have that vote, to put that legislation forward and to have that vote. I think that is something that some folks are considering.
Wow.
Again,
Wow.
Amazing. He doesn't even mention that you need some sort of grounds to impeach a president. There has to be high crimes and misdemeanors.
It's serious business.
Yeah. Where is Chuck saying, well, what are the high crimes and misdemeanors that they're pressuring you to acknowledge, right? It just seems like he's already ingested the notion that we're going to impeach because that's what we do. And he's asking an insider like, okay, well, how are you going to vote? Vote on what? Vote for, I mean, it's just, It's remarkable how inside the process he is when he's supposed to be broadcasting to the American people.
He seems to be concerned with will it work, right? Not with whether it's worthy or whether it's in good faith or whether it's pro-democratic, but will it work?
Will it work?
What kind of
what are the
strategy?
chances that it will pass? And wow, if even you are hearing this kind of thing, he was led to a wow, but it wasn't the wow that it should have been. The wow should have been like, how can you impeach presidents without having some reason? That's the wow. Didn't appear here.
So, I mean, what is that? Is that just sort of reversion to all of this as a political game with no real stakes?
And the insider's perspective, where the idea of impeachment in the abstract, like we're going to impeach because that's what we do, has already kind of been normalized in its own way. And that's what he's asking about. Whereas informing the audience would mean explaining this whole thing, like they want to impeach, but they don't really have anything to impeach him for. But none of that ever comes up. It's all like glossed over so that Chuck can marvel at how extreme it's gotten.
What's wrong with a reporter being neutral when the political sides are sort of fighting out? You want to stay neutral, right? I mean, what's wrong with that?
Well, yes. I mean, you don't want to join the team Republicans or team Democrats. That's not the role of the press. But when you have a danger to the entire system of democracy, including a free press, then you have to go outside your normal bag of tricks and start opposing that. Because if you're not able to push against an anti-democratic movement, then what are you doing in this job?
So let's watch this. This is about I think we're going to watch something about the January 6th committee, which I think has fried the circuits of a lot of reporters who cover politics. Let's see.
Let's do it.
There are plans for a bipartisan congressional committee to investigate the deadly assault on the Capitol, but they are in disarray this morning. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi rejected 2 of Republican leader Kevin McCarthy's 5 picks for the panel. Both of those congressmen have opposed an investigation into what happened on January 6th. Chris Van Cleve has more from Capitol Hill. Chris, good morning.
Good morning. Speaker Pelosi justified her decision, saying January 6th is so important it warranted this unprecedented action. Kevin McCarthy then blasted her for playing politics and said the GOP will do its own investigation. Let's be clear here. Both parties are going to claim victory because this plays directly to their bases.
What do you think?
Oh, that's a classic setup where you have the political game being played by both sides.
And, you know, there's something extra going on here, too, because this particular story that young reporter's talking about, Kevin McCarthy, the people he's talking about who are rejecting it and then playing to their base, they're parties to the case. They're fact witnesses. In some cases, coup plotters themselves.
Exactly. They're totally wrapped up in it. And you see this a lot where, okay, the Republicans are saying that, but are there any grounds for it? That is their defense.
The appropriate journalistic term for what's been going on with the reaction to the January 6th committee is cover-up.
Yeah, and there should be nothing wrong with saying it that way when there are so many facts to back up this argument that these people are involved in the coup. These people are part of the plot. They are, yes, engaged in a cover-up in the classic sense of the word, and we have documents that show that. We have evidence.
Let's look at the local press coverage of Donald Trump from, I think this one's from Green Bay, Wisconsin. Let's see what we got here.
Trump promised to go after Democrats on the Green Deal, late-term abortions, and immigration, and push back on Democrats pushing for more investigations.
Democrats put all their hopes behind their collusion delusion, which has now been totally exposed to the world as a complete and total fraud.
Semi-retired Trump supporter Todd Evers wore his POTUS 45 jersey to the rally. He wants Trump to talk more about his accomplishments and less about investigations.
Investigations are getting old. I don't need to hear that anymore.
So that's, normal campaign stop. Candidate attacks opponents, goes after his critics. Trump supporters like Trump. Big breaking news.
Yeah. And also, many of those charges are just wacky. But this illustrates one of the really vexing things about covering Trump, which is if you simply report in detail what he said and what he's done, it sounds biased because it's so outrageous. Right? And Wisconsin is a place where journalists hear it if they've said anything that supporters think of as anti-Trump. Right? It's a battleground state, and there are a lot of Trump fans there. Journalists are supposed to alert us to things that are wild and extreme and new and like another territory. Man bites dog. Right? That's part of their job. But on the other hand, there's another part of their code where they're supposed to know how things work, what's routine, what's become normal.
And then the New York Times tweeted on that day, covering the actual rally. The New York Times, to be fair, covered the outlandish things that Donald Trump said. But here was the tweet, quoting New York Times tweet here. At a rally on Saturday in Green Bay, Wisconsin, President Trump revived an inaccurate refrain about doctors executing babies. Revived an inaccurate refrain.
Well, this is a difficulty that's peculiar to the New York Times. The institutional voice, as well as the institutional imagination of the New York Times, just has trouble accepting that Trump is as wild and as threatening as he actually is.
But they're not, I mean, Jay, they're not out to do a disservice. I like to impart good motives on the New York Times, referring to an outlandish lie, not only an outlandish lie, but one that is trafficking in QAnon language, intentionally, I'm sure, that doctors and mothers perform a birth and decide whether to execute the baby, reframing that as reviving an inaccurate refrain.
Yeah.
I know they're not trying to do a disservice, but they must know that it's just not accurate to say.
It's not accurate. It's bloodless. It's minimizing. It's normalizing.
And it's laundering. That's the thing. It's laundering.
It's a kind of laundering.
You're laundering for a politician. They don't want to be doing that.
No, they don't. But they also don't want to come up with a new institutional voice and say our old one is broken.
So I think we watched some cable news, we watched some broadcast national, we watched some local with the New York Times. Trump's probably running again.
Yes.
Is the press ready? Have you seen signs that any of these lessons, or at least some of them, have been learned adequately?
Well, yes and no. The press is very clued in, I think, to the difficulties that are going to arise around the act of voting itself. But when you have a candidate running against the system, when you have a candidate willing to bring down American democracy in order to take power, that is a reality for which there's no page in the press's playbook. You need a consensus understanding of what the role of the press is. And that consensus is actually breaking apart, but it's happening slowly, so we don't quite see it.
Jay, thanks for being here. Good watching with you.
Great. Thanks, Todd.
That does it for this edition of Breaking the Vote. When we're back, we go to Pennsylvania, where Democrats and Republicans are teaming up to fend off a conspiratorial candidate for governor who could swing 2024 in Trump's direction. Plus, what the state of democracy around the world tells us about where things are headed here at home, and a whole lot more. Make sure to sign up for our weekly Breaking the Vote newsletter at vice.com/breakingthevote, and we'll see you next time.
I'm Michael Learmonth, editor-in-chief of Vice News. Too often, traditional news outlets shy away from the real stories and experiences of those living through global conflicts. Not Vice News. Our reporters are on the ground, fearlessly covering the human stories that shape our world. You and millions of others can continue to read, watch, and listen to Vice News for free. But we hope you'll consider making a one-time or ongoing contribution of any size at vice.com/contribute. Every contribution, no matter how big or small, helps support the journalism Vice News brings to you every day. Thank you.